Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere far away from not in miles, more in time and imagination. You're about to step onto the damp soil of Aroa, long before anyone thought of calling it New Zealand. You'll notice the air feels heavier here, like it's carrying secrets in every gust of wind. And yes, just so you know, if you try to survive here without local knowledge, you probably last about, one afternoon before realizing, wait, why is everything either sharp, wet, or covered in feathers? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. This way you'll know when the next sleepy little adventure arrives. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me what city you're in and what time it is right now for you. I love seeing how this sleepy community is scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take your first cautious steps toward a gathering of people. They're working with featherstiny, delicate things that catch the moonlight as if they were sparks of stars. At first glance, you might assume they're making decorations, something fancy to wear to a festival, but the longer you look, the more you realize this isn't just fashion, this is storytelling. These cloaks, called kahoharuhuru, are like books written without ink. Every feather is a word, every color a sentence, every pattern a paragraph in a story passed from one generation to the next. The main knowledge here: Māori feather cloaks were not ordinary garments. They were deeply symbolic, reserved for chiefs, leaders, and people of mono-spiritual prestige. Wearing one was like carrying an entire genealogy on your back. A cloak wasn't just about looking important. It was literally a history book that moved when you moved. And here's a small but fascinating detail. Certain cloaks used feathers from birds that no longer exist today. Take the higher bird. For instance, its long tail feathers were considered treasures. If you wore higher feathers, you weren't just stylish. You were basically wearing a status update more powerful than any crown Umwaji could ever convey. Sadly, the bird itself is extinct, leaving only its memory in these cloaks. Of course, historians are still debating how exactly people read the language of these feathers. Was there a strict code, like a secret alphabet, or was it more interpretative, with meaning shifting depending on who wore it and when? Some scholars argue the designs were rigid and specific. Others think they were more fluid, like poetry woven into fabric. And you, standing here, watching the cloak shimmer in the firelight, probably feel that both answers could be true at the same time. As you lean closer, you notice how the feathers whisper when touched by the breeze. You could almost imagine them talking, telling you about battles fought, alliances formed, marriages arranged, ancestors remembered. It's like eavesdropping on a conversation from centuries ago, except instead of voices, colors and textures carrying the message. And the funny thing is, if you try to read this cloak the way you'd read a book, you'd probably get lost after the first feather. It's not linear. It doesn't go left to right, top to bottom. It's more like standing in a forest. You take it all in at once. The colors, the patterns, the movement. The cloak isn't trying to give you a plot twist, it's trying to surround you with memory. So you sit down watching the weavers work and you realize something. These cloaks are less about covering the body and more about wrapping someone in identity. A cloak is given to you. It's saying, you belong here. Your story is woven into ours, and in that moment, you stop being just an observer and start feeling like maybe, just maybe, you're part of the story too. The feathers in front of you aren't just beautiful, they feel alive. Like each one is carrying a whisper from the forest tonight. The weavers are sorting through piles of them, glassy black, warm brown, speckled white. At first you think it's just for variety, like decorating a hat with flair, but soon you realize these feathers come from birds with stories of their own. The Māori didn't simply see birds as creatures fluttering in the trees. They saw them as messengers, ancestors, sometimes even gods in disguise. Imagine a kera, the New Zealand wood pigeon, wobbling about after feasting on fermented berries. It looks funny, sure, like a tipsy uncle at a wedding, but its feathers, those shimmering greens and purples, were considered tapu, sacred, barked and woven. They added prestige and spiritual protection to a cloak. And then there were the kiwi, shy nocturnal diggers. Their downy brown feathers didn't look flashy, but their rarity gave them power. Wearing kiwi feathers was like whispering to the night, I belong to the hidden world too. You could say it was the equivalent of wearing a hoodie that makes you invisible in the forest. Here's the mainstream knowledge. Every bird species had a meaning. Some were associated with fertility, others with strength, others with chiefly authority. The cloaks became encyclopedias of natural and spiritual symbolism. To wear one was not only to declare who you were in society, but also to signal your connection with the natural world. Now, for a quirky little fact, the T-bird, with its white tuft under the throat like a tiny cravat, wasn't just admired for its feathers. It could actually mimic human speech. Imagine a cloak shimmering with tea feathers while somewhere in the treetops its cousins were gossiping in half-human voices. The effect must have felt both magical and eerie, like the cloak itself might start talking back to you. And of course, historians still debate how far this symbolism went. Did every feather type carry a universally agreed meaning across all iwi, all tribes, or did different regions and families invent their own associations? Some scholars suggest the codes were strict, like heraldry in medieval Europe. All others believe it was looser, shaped by storytelling traditions rather than rules carved in stone. As you sit there, listening to the rustle of feathers, you realize something important. These birds weren't just hunted, they were honored. To take a feather wasn't to strip the land, but to borrow from it. You'd whisper a karakia, a prayer, acknowledging the life you were taking part of. It was less about I caught a bird and more about the forest gave me a gift. The cloak spread out before you suddenly looks less like clothing and more like a map made of wings and stories. Each bird is a compass point, guiding the wearer not only through the physical world, but also through the invisible networks of ancestry and myth. And in that moment, You feel the strange sensation that the feathers are watching you back, as if to say, "Remember, you're a guest here, walk carefully." The night air grows quieter, except for the steady rhythm of hands moving thread through feather. You notice how deliberate every gesture is, nothing rushed, nothing wasted. But women and men weaving these cloaks aren't just artisans. They're something closer to guardians of memory. Each tug on the fiber feels like it's pulling at the past. The mainstream knowledge here, in Māori culture, the cloak makers, often women, held an honored role. Weaving was not casual work, it was sacred, a practice bound up with ritual, patience, and training. You couldn't just sit down with some feathers and string and improvise. Generations of skill went into knowing how to bind feathers so they lay flat, shimmered at the right angle, and survived years of wear. To watch a cloak take shape was to witness months, sometimes years, of quiet labor. And it wasn't just technical skill. There were rules, restrictions about who could weave and under what conditions. Weavers observed tapu, working in designated spaces, reciting chants, or abstaining from certain foods while weaving. You realize, with a half smile, that if you tried to sneak in and help, your cloak would probably fall apart the second someone sneezed on it. That's how much expertise it required. Here's a quirky detail. The weaving fibers themselves were often made from harakik, the New Zealand flax plant. Its fibers could be softened by chewing, a process not exactly glamorous but effective. Imagine rows of aunties sitting around, casually chewing flax strips to prep them. Not the most elegant image, but it shows how much everyday life and sacred work overlapped. You overhear someone say the word mana. That's when it clicks. Weaving cloaks wasn't just a technical, though it was a way of transmitting mana, the spiritual authority and prestige of the community. A cloak carried mana from its weaver, its materials, its wearer, and its stories. It was less like a shirt and more like a portable shrine. And historians, they're still debating exactly how this authority transferred. Was the mana stronger if the weaver was from a particular lineage, or was it the ritual itself that mattered most? Some argue that only women of high rank could create the most sacred cloaks. Others insist that the act of weaving itself elevated the maker. Regardless of birth, the truth may be, as always, a tangled thread. As you sit closer, the crackle of the fire mixing with the quiet murmur of voices, you realize something. These cloak makers aren't just building garments, they're building continuity. Every knot ties ancestors to descendants. Every feather stitched is a reminder that memory isn't stored in books alone. It can also be carried on shoulders, bustling softly in the night. You lean back, imagining what it would be like to wear one of these cloaks, not just the weight of the feathers, but the weight of generations. You'd feel taller, heavier, more rooted, and maybe that's the point. The cloak doesn't just cover you, it transforms you. The firelight flickers across a bundle of feathers laid neatly on woven mats. At first glance, they're just colors: reds, yellows, blacks, shimmering greens, but then you notice how the weavers treat each shade like a voice. Some are loud, others soft, some playful, some solemn. The cloak, when finished, won't just look like a rainbow, it'll speak in colors. Here's the broad fact: in Maori feather cloaks, color wasn't random decoration. Each hue carried meaning, and combinations could tell layered stories. A chief wearing a cloak heavy with black feathers might be signaling dignity, authority, or connection to the night, in streaks of white. And suddenly you're talking about balance, purity, or new beginnings. It's not just fashion, it's coded language. Now for a curious tidbit. Some cloaks use the bright red feathers of the KK, a parrot with a cheeky reputation. These birds were clever mimics, notorious for stealing food and making a racket at dawn. To wear their feathers was to wear mischief itself, a little wink of humor sewn into an otherwise solemn garment. You can almost picture a chief stepping into a meeting, cloak blazing with red, and everyone silently thinking, "Oh, he's got jokes." Historians, of course, argue about just how rigid these color codes were. Did every iwi, every tribe, read the same symbolism? Or did a cloak's meaning shift depending on local stories and personal interpretation? Some researchers believe there was a consistent language across regions. Others say meaning was flexible, fluid, like an oral tale that changed with every telling. What you see tonight supports the second theory. The weavers debate softly among themselves. Does this streak of green mean prosperity? Or is it a nod to a family ancestor known for his forest knowledge? One woman insists it's about fertility. Another chuckles and says, "It's just green. Let's not overthink it." You sigh, realizing the truth might live somewhere in between, part symbolism, part practicality, part personal flair. And there's something striking about the way the colors shimmer together. Move a little to the left, and the black feathers dominate. Shift to the right, and suddenly the reds blaze through. It's as if the cloak is alive, changing its mood depending on who looks at it and when. Imagine entering a hall by torchlight. Your cloak wouldn't just hang, it would perform. Here's the funny part. While you're sitting there trying to decode meanings like a sleep-deprived scholar, the weavers themselves laugh easily, as if to say, "Relax, it's beautiful," and that's enough. You realize the cloaks weren't always solemn artifacts, they were also playful, vibrant, woven with joy as much as with duty. The pile of sorted feathers shrinks, and the cloak grows. Slowly, a pattern emerges: dark base, bright streaks across the chest, a subtle rhythm of alternating shades. You feel like you're not watching someone make clothing, but someone compose music, each color a note, each row a phrase. And when the last thread is tightened, you find yourself holding your breath, because suddenly it's not just a cloak anymore, it's a voice, a chorus of colors humming softly in the night air. The cloak is growing heavier now, row by row, but it's not the weight of the feathers that strikes you, it's the weight of the stories being stitched in. Each knot looks ordinary, just thread pulled through feather and flax, but you soon realize every stitch is a footnote. If cloaks are books, the stitches are the punctuation marks keeping the whole story legible. Here's the broad historical point. Maori weaving wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a system of recording. Each stitch could reflect relationships, kinship ties, victories in battle, alliances formed through marriage. Think of it as a wearable diary, one that no thief could steal without also carrying your identity to where it was to declare, "This is who I am and who stands behind me." But then comes the quirky fact. Sometimes small imperfections were left in on purpose. A slightly crooked line of feathers, a thread knotted a little off-center, tiny errors that weren't mistakes at all. Weavers believed perfection belonged only to the gods. So humans should leave a trace of asymmetry to show humility. You chuckle, realizing your messy handwriting might have qualified as sacred weaving in this context. The fire crackles, and you lean closer to watch a weaver pause mid-stitch, almost as if she's listening to something. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's the voices of those she's weaving for. Scholars still debate this part. Did the weavers consciously encode stories with specific techniques? Or was the meaning carried more by oral tradition and context? Some say the stitches were literal symbols, like hieroglyphs. Others argue they were mnemonic prompts that reminded wearers of stories told aloud. The truth likely lives somewhere in that tension between what's woven and what's spoken. You notice how each weaver adds her own rhythm. One tightens every knot sharply, creating crisp rows. Another works with a softer hand, letting the feathers flow loosely, almost like water. It's not unlike different handwriting styles, Sami language, different flair. You imagine a cloak expert, centuries later, holding up to Cloaks and saying, "Oh, yes. This one looks like Antime's work. See how the knots lean slightly to the left." And in that moment, you realize a cloak isn't just about the person who wears it, it's also about the person who made it. Their touch is literally there, invisible but permanent, like a whisper stitched into the lining. If someone wore your cloak centuries later, they'd be carrying your fingerprints, your patience, your mistakes, your pride all without knowing it. The weaver ties off another thread, leans back, and sighs. It's a quiet sigh, but you can tell it carries relief. This row is done. The cloak has grown by maybe an inch, but spiritually it feels like a mile. The people around the fire nod in quiet appreciation, not because the cloak is finished, but because they all know one more story has been safely tucked into its fabric. The night deepens, and suddenly the mood shifts. A hush falls as a chief enters the circle. You've seen cloaks in progress. You've heard the feathers whisper, but now you're about to see what happens when one is worn. The cloak is lifted gently, as if it were a child, and draped across the chief's shoulders. For a moment, you almost forget you are looking at a person. It's as though the whole sky has bent down and wrapped itself around him. Here's the solid knowledge. In Māori society, cloaks weren't for casual wear. Chiefs, warriors, and people of high rank wore them during important gatherings, ceremonies, or negotiations. Feather cloak was an announcement of authority, a declaration that you carried not only your own mana, but the mana of your ancestors. If you stepped into a meeting draped in one, you didn't need to say much. Cloak said it all. And then there's the strange but delightful image when the cloak spread wide in the wind. It looked like wings. Observers often described chiefs as if they had the sky trailing behind them. Imagine showing up at a council meeting today with your outfit making you look like an eagle mid-flight. Subtle, not really. Effective, absolutely. Of course, historians can't resist a good argument. Some claim the cloaks were purely symbolic, reserved for rituals and ceremony. Others insist they were also practical, functioning as warmth against the cold. The truth might be both. A garment that was at once a heater, a shield, and a portable family tree. You picture yourself wrapped in one, countsy against the chill, while simultaneously radiating "Don't mess with me, I carry the sky." The chief before you shifts, and the cloak rustles. Everyone around responds without words. Some nod, some bow slightly, others just fall silent. You realize this isn't just fashion, this is theater. The cloak transforms him from an individual into a living embodiment of the tribe. It's like watching someone put on a crown, except the crown moves, shimmers, and breathes with every step. Here's the quirky fact: some chiefs were even buried with their cloaks, believing they would carry money into the afterlife. A cloak didn't just represent status in this world, it was luggage for the next. You imagine packing for eternity and thinking, clothes. Just one cloak, thanks, I'm good. The fire flickers, the cloak glows, and for a moment you feel the weight of silence pressing down. Not heavy, not threatening, but reverent. You realize you're watching something more powerful than speeches or weapons. The quiet assertion that history can be worn. And as the cloak settles around the chief, you can almost hear it murmur, "The sky walks with me." The fire burns low now, but your eyes stay wide. You've seen how cloaks carry authority, how they shimmer with bird spirits and ancestral stories. But tonight you learn something surprising. Cloaks weren't just symbols, they were also currency. Not the kind you jingled in a pouch, but the kind that could buy loyalty, forgiveness, or even peace. Here's the solid knowledge: in Māori culture, feather cloaks were among the most prized, tone treasures. They could be given as gifts to seal alliances, to honor visitors, or to recognize great deeds. Imagine shaking hands after a tense negotiation and someone casually dragging a cloak over your shoulders. That's not just a gift, it's a contract, an unspoken promise stronger than ink on paper. And here's a curious tidbit: sometimes cloaks were considered more valuable than money, more persuasive than gold. European traders, when they first arrived, often underestimated their worth, thinking just some feathers stitched together. But soon enough, they realized a cloak could open doors no coin ever could. You picture a puzzled sailor, wondering why his bag of silver was ignored, while a feather cloak drew a crowd of odd faces. Of course, historians love to debate this. Were cloaks really currency in the economic sense? Or were they sacred gifts that carried meaning beyond material value? Some scholars argue they were never meant for traditionally as tokens of relationship. Others point to accounts of cloaks being exchanged in transactions, prove they function like wealth. You, watching the exchange by the fire, suspect it was both sacred and practical, priceless yet practical enough to seal a deal. The mood around the fire shifts into storytelling. An elder describes how one cloak was offered to settle a feud that had threatened to split a community. Another tale tells of a marriage where a cloak was the dowry, the bride stepping forward wrapped in the mana of her ancestors. In each story, the cloak is more than fabric, it's the glue holding society together. You smile, realizing how ironic it is in modern life. Wealth is stored in banks, locked away, invisible numbers on a screen. Here, wealth was stored in feathers, in something so fragile it could blow away in the wind, yet somehow, that fragility made it stronger because only respect and shared meaning kept it valuable. As you sit back, the embers glowing faintly, you picture yourself in the role of a traveler. What could you possibly trade? A handful of coins, a shiny trinket, none of it would compare. But if you carried a cloak, heavy with feathers and stories, you could bargain with chiefs, build friendships, maybe even buy forgiveness for the mistakes you haven't yet made. The elder finishes his tale, and for a long moment, nobody speaks. The cloak resting nearby seems to shimmer just a little brighter, as if it knows it has been acknowledged not as clothing, but as treasure. The night grows cooler, but the stories keep you warm. You've heard how cloaks were gifts, how they could mend feuds or seal marriages. But now someone leans closer to the fire and whispers another truth. These cloaks didn't just belong to moments of peace. They walked onto battlefields too. Here's the solid history. Chiefs and warriors sometimes wore cloaks during times of war. Not for practical armor, feathers don't stop spears, but as declarations of presence and authority. Imagine marching toward an enemy while your cloak blazed with shimmering colors, announcing without words, "I am here, and my ancestors walk with me." On the battlefield, that sight alone could be as intimidating as any weapon. And then there's the curious fact, cloaks also appeared in peace negotiations. A chief might wear his finest garment when sitting down to settle disputes. The cloak would speak on his behalf, reminding everyone that he carried mana, that his words deserved respect. It's a little like today's politicians wearing tailored suits, except instead of our money, you've got a garment that doubles as a family saga and a divine symbol. Of course, historians can't resist the question, were these cloaks strategic tools, deliberately worn to influence outcomes? Or were they simply customary attire with symbolism layered on afterward? Some scholars argue chiefs dressed this way to manipulate perception. Others think the cloaks were natural extensions of their role, watching the shimmer in the firelight. You suspect both are true. Cloaks were strategy and tradition, diplomacy and fashion, all stitched into one. You imagine the strange duality. In one scene, a warrior stands at the front line, feathers fluttering in the wind like banners of defiance. In another, the same cloak is laid gently across the shoulders of an enemy turned ally as a peace offering. The same garment that could inspire fear in battle could soothe tension in a council house. That kind of versatility puts modern power dressing to shame. And here's the slightly amusing thought. Cloaks were never subtle. If you wanted to slip quietly into a meeting, A feather cloak was not the outfit for you. It would shimmer, rustle, and demand attention. Wearing one was the equivalent of saying, I'd like everyone to notice me immediately. Thank you, in a way. It was the ancient version of showing up with a microphone. The cloak was the announcement system. The fire pops, and you lean back, realizing how fascinating it is that the same object could carry such opposite messages: defiance and reconciliation, intimidation and comfort. It's almost as if the cloaks themselves adapted to the mood, speaking the language needed in the moment. You look up at the night sky and think, maybe the lesson here is that stories, like cloaks, can change their role depending on how they're worn. Sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, sometimes war, sometimes peace, and you can't help but smile, wondering what kind of cloak you'd choose if you had to walk into tomorrow's battles or tomorrow's reconciliations. The embers glow low, and you think the stories are nearly done until someone holds up a feather that looks different, longer, brighter, almost exotic. You blink because you realize not all the feathers in these cloaks came from the forests outside the village. Some traveled oceans to get here. Here's the solid history. Māori cloaks sometimes included feathers obtained through long-distance exchange. Cloaks weren't just local records. They were global ones, stitched with reminders of journeys, trade, and contact with distant peoples. Imagine wearing a cloak lined with feathers from a bird that never even lived on your island. It's like slipping on a jacket today, embroidered with patches from countries you've never been to but here. The patches actually meant the connections were real. And here's the curious part. Early accounts suggest some cloaks even carried the feathers of peacocks and parrots introduced by traders. These weren't just decorative, they were conversation starters. Picture a gathering where someone leans in and whispers, "That green feather came all the way from across the sea." It wasn't just about status, it was about proof that your people's network stretched far beyond the horizon. Of course, historians still argue over the scale of this. Were these foreign feathers rare, a kind of luxury item for the highest chiefs? Or were they more common than we think, circulating through intertribal trade routes? Some scholars claim they were exceptional. Others suggest Māori were remarkably connected, and exotic feathers may have been woven in more often than we realize. The truth, as always, seems to rest in the gaps of evidence. You picture the scene, a trader's canoe arriving at the shore, sacks of strange feathers carried onto land, children gather, pointing and laughing at their shimmer, elders nod gravely, already thinking how those colors might alter the story of a future cloak. And when the feathers are finally woven in, the cloak becomes more than a local emblem, it becomes a map of journeys, a silent testimony that people here were never isolated dreamers, but navigators of vast seas. Here's the quirky detail. Sometimes cloaks carried feathers from birds so unusual that they sparked myths. A feather that glowed too bright might be said to have fallen from the sky, or carried by a god in disguise. It makes you wonder if a few cloaks still sitting in museum glass cases today have feathers that were once mistaken for divine proof. The cloak before you gleams with both familiar Kiwi down and one startling splash of turquoise that catches the firelight differently. You don't know which bird it came from or how far it traveled, but you feel it tugging at your imagination. It's a reminder that stories don't just stay home, they hitch rides across oceans, tuck themselves into gifts, and settle quietly into fabric until someone like you leans closer and asks, "Where did this come from?" The turquoise feather still shimmers in your mind as the weavers shift their work indoors. Tonight, are invited to sit among them not as a chief, not as a guest of honor, but as family. You realize weaving isn't just sacred craft, it's also a social event, something that pulls everyone into its orbit like a fire on a cold night. Here's the core history. Weaving was often a wow affair. The word wow means family, but not in the narrow sense, more like an extended network of parents, children, cousins, aunties, and grandparents. Feather cloaks were built not just from feathers and flax, but from conversations, laughter, and a passing on of skills. You didn't just learn to weave, you learned to belong. And then comes the quirky image, children lying on their stomachs, plucking downy feathers from piles, trying not to sneeze as fluff floats into their noses, grandmothers correcting knots with gentle clucks of disapproval, teenage boy half helping, half daydreaming, until someone flicks a feather at his face. The process may have been sacred, but it wasn't humorless, it was community life stitched into fabric. Historians, of course, puzzle over the balance between ritual and routine. Are all weaving sessions conducted under strict tapu, or were some more relaxed, like family evenings filled with chatter? Some argue that sacred cloaks demanded silence and ceremony. Others believe even the most prestigious garments were shaped in everyday domestic spaces. Watching the scene, you suspect it was both, ritual wrapped inside routine, the sacred carried out in the warmth of family life. You notice how storytelling flows as easily as thread. One elder recalls a relative who wore a cloak to a peace gathering. Another recounts how a feather once flew into a soup pot, only to be rescued and later stitched into a cloak, earning the nickname "the cloak that tastes of stew." You smile, realizing history isn't always solemn. Sometimes it smells faintly of dinner. Here's the funny fact. Some weavers would sing while working, the rhythm of their voices syncing with the motion of their hands. The songs weren't necessarily about feathers at all. Sometimes they were love songs, jokes, or lullabies, which means if you listen closely to certain cloaks, they might not only tell you about chiefs and gods, but also hum softly of old jokes and childhood naps. The longer you sit, the more you realize the cloak isn't just an object, it's an environment. It gathers people, it absorbs their voices, it grows layer by layer, not just in feathers but in shared moments. You think of modern objects, phones, computers that connect people across distances. The feather cloak did the same, only it was tangible, heavy, warm, and much less likely to need a software update. And when the evening finally winds down, the unfinished cloak rests gently on the loom like a sleeping body. You see it not as an artifact in progress, but as a family diary still being written. waiting for tomorrow's laughter to add the next line. By now, you've seen cloaks carried on shoulders of chiefs, stitched by families, even traded across seas. But tonight, different scene unfolds. In the dim light of a meeting house, a cloak is carefully draped not on a person, but on a carved wooden figure. And suddenly, you realize these cloaks weren't just for humans. Here's the historical knowledge. Feather cloaks could also be used in rituals, placed on statues, offered to actual spiritual beings or laid on sacred spaces. They weren't limited to status symbols, they were offerings, bridging the human and the divine. To cloak a carving was to acknowledge that the gods too deserved warmth, beauty, and mana. And here's the curious detail. Sometimes cloaks were placed over objects like ancestral relics, or even wrapped around stones considered embodiments of power. Imagine tucking a boulder in for the night with the same care you'd use for your child. It sounds odd, maybe even whimsical, but to the Māori, it was a way of affirming that life, spirit, and story weren't confined to human skin. Of course, scholars still debate the exact meaning of these practices. Were the cloaks considered literal garments for the gods, or were they symbolic, representing respect and continuity? Some argue that cloaks fed the mana of sacred objects. Others think they were more about human ritual gestures of reverence. The ambiguity lingers, feather light and hard to pin down. You watch as the cloak is smoothed across the figure's shoulders. The firelight makes the feathers gleam, turning the statue into something almost alive. For a moment, you half expect it to blink back at you. The room grows quieter, and you feel the hush isn't fear, it's acknowledgement. Like everyone senses the cloak has extended the tribe's embrace beyond human limits. Here's the quirky part. There are oral traditions where even cloaks themselves were treated as beings with personality. A particularly beautiful cloak might be given a name, spoken of as if it had mood, scrumpy if it tangled, proud if it shimmered in sunlight. You smile at the thought of a cloak sulking in a corner because no one wore it to the feast. The longer you sit, the more you realize these cloaks blur the lines between human and divine, between object and story. They're not costumes, not even just symbols, they're vessels. They hold memory, yes, but they also channel presence. And in the stillness of this night, with the cloak glowing faintly against carved wood, you wonder if perhaps you've underestimated just how alive a garment can be. The hush of the ritual still lingers in your ears when the scene changes. You're no longer in a smoky meeting house, you're standing on a 19th century wharf. The air smells of salt and coal smoke, ships creak, oats sprain, and there in the crowd, European traders and missionaries catch sight of something that makes their eyes widen. Feather cloaks. Here's the broad fact. When Europeans first encountered Māori cloaks, they were stunned. They'd seen velvet, silk, and ermine back home. But these garments shimmered with a life they couldn't categorize. Some collectors described them as marvels, others as curiosities. What they agreed on, though, was their value. Cloaks quickly became objects of trade, gifts exchanged between Māori leaders and colonial authorities. And here's the curious part. Many of those cloaks ended up far from home and were presented as diplomatic gifts to kings and queens in Europe. Others found their way into museums, sometimes catalogued poorly, treated as anonymous native artifacts. Imagine walking through a dusty Victorian gallery where a cloak hangs silently on the wall, stripped of its stories, labeled only feathered garment, a masterpiece reduced to a footnote. Of course, historians still argue about what this moment meant. Were cloaks willingly shared as symbols of goodwill, or were they taken under pressure, exchanged in uneven deals, or even stolen outright? Some scholars insist Maori leaders saw gifting cloaks as strategic diplomacy. Others argue colonial hunger for exotic objects skewed the meaning of the exchange. The truth, as always, is a tug of war between pride and loss. You picture the tension, a Maori chief dragging a cloak over the shoulders of a European governor, the gesture filled with mana, expectation, and respect. On the other side, the governor accepts it, perhaps admiring the craftsmanship but perhaps not grasping the spiritual weight stitched into every feather. It's a bit like handing over a family photo album, only for the recipient to treat it as wall decoration. Here's a quirky detail. Some Europeans try to wear the cloaks as fashion, strutting in them like opera coats. The result, on most accounts, was slightly ridiculous ill-fitting, misunderstood, a kind of cultural cosplay before the term existed, yet even in awkwardness, the cloaks commanded attention, refusing to shrink into mere costume. As you stand on that wharf, watching the mingling of cultures, you feel the push and pull in the air on one hand. Exchange you journeys for the cloaks, new connections across the world on the other. Lost risk that meaning would unravel once the feathers left the hands of those who understood their language. The ship creaks again, sails below, and you see a cloak being carried aboard. Its feathers flash in the sunlight one last time before disappearing into the hold, and in that instant, you realize history is not just what's kept, but what's carried away. The image of the cloak vanishing into a ship's hold still lingers when you find yourself in a different kind of room, quiet, dim, ironed with shelves. No smoke, no chanting, no bustling wharfany dust motes dancing in shafts of light. You're in a museum storeroom, and here, among crates and labels, lie cloaks that have slept for centuries. Here's the core knowledge. Many Maori cloaks were taken overseas and stored away in institutions, often with little understanding of their origins. For decades, they sat a day in collections, unremarked upon except as ethnographic specimens. But in recent years, some of these cloaks have been rediscovered, identified, and most importantly reconnected with the descendants of the people who wove them. And here's the curious part. Sometimes these rediscoveries happen almost by accident. A curator opens a drawer and finds a cloak mislabeled as Pacific textile. Researchers trace the feathers, the weaving style, and suddenly realize it's a treasure tied to a specific iwi, a specific story. Imagine the mix of emotions: pride at the discovery, sorrow at the long separation, hope at the possibility of return. Of course, scholars still argue about the ethics of it. Should all cloaks be repatriated to Aroa, or should some remain abroad, where they tell global audiences about Māori artistry? Some say keeping them overseas is another form of colonial possession. Others argue visibility abroad spreads appreciation. The debate is as tangled as the threads in the cloaks themselves. You picture a Māori descendant standing in front of a glass case, staring at a cloak their ancestor once touched. They can't reach through the glass, but you can feel the connection humming anyway. The cloak is no longer just an artifact, it's a relative, waiting to be welcomed home. Here's the quirky detail. When cloaks are finally brought out of storage, they often need conservation work. Feathers may be fragile, threads loosened. Conservators use tiny tools, brushes, tweezers, even humidifiers to gently coax life back into the garment. It's like giving first aid to a sleeping ancestor, careful not to disturb the stories resting inside. As you walk through the storeroom, the silence feels heavy, but not empty. It's the silence of waiting. Each cloak is folded carefully, resting, as if dancing between worlds. You realize these aren't just museum pieces, they're time travelers, caught mid-journey, waiting for the day someone calls them back into the circle of family and firelight. And when that day comes, when a cloak is finally lifted from its glass box and returned, you can almost hear the feathers exhale, like they've been holding their breath for far too long. The storeroom fades, and you find yourself back among scholars, voices rising and falling in debate, not around a fire this time, but in lecture halls and conferences, where PowerPoint slides replace woven mats, yet the subject remains the same: feather cloaks, and the arguments just as intricate as the cloaks themselves. Here's the broad fact: academics still disagree on the true essence of these garments. Are they primarily aesthetic, brilliant displays of artistry, like wearable masterpieces, or were they primarily symbolic, functioning as coded systems of rank, genealogy, and spirituality? The arguments sometimes feel like two sides pulling on the same thread, neither willing to let go. And here's the curious part: some scholars even debate whether cloaks can be read like texts. A few argue that specific stitch patterns or feather arrangements are strict symbolic codes like an alphabet in fiber and color. Others dismiss that idea, saying cloaks were more flexible, their meaning shifting with context, oral tradition, and personal interpretation. One researcher joked, "They expecting a cloak to read like a book is like trying to summarize a lullaby by analyzing its notes without ever hearing it sung." You picture these debates as a sort of modern weaving threads of argument crossing and tangling, never fully resolved. One paper insists cloaks reflect mana above all. Another claims the real focus was community identity. A third highlights aesthetics. Listening to it all, you realize the debates don't weaken the cloak's meaning, they multiply it. The uncertainty is part of the richness. Here's a quirky detail. Sometimes disagreements go down to single feathers. Was that red KK plume meant to signal warlike authority, Or was it just the weaver liking the color red? Scholars have written entire essays over such questions. The academic equivalent of arguing whether grandma added salt for symbolism or just because it tasted better. As you lean back, you think about how cloaks themselves might view all this debate. If they could speak, perhaps they'd sigh. Why argue? We're both beautiful and meaningful. They didn't need to choose sides. They shimmered. They carried mana. They warmed shoulders. They tied families together. They were never just one thing, and maybe that's what makes them so enduring. The fire is gone now, replaced by fluorescent lights in a conference room, but the feeling remains. Cloaks resist neat definitions. They whisper in feathers what arguments in words can't quite capture. Maybe that's the point. Some stories aren't meant to be nailed down. They're meant to drift, to shimmer, to keep you leaning closer, always having wonder. The debates quiet down, and suddenly you're back under the night sky. The air feels softer now, as if the land itself is exhaling after so many stories. A final cloak is laid across someone's shoulders, not as wealth, but as armor, not as a symbol of negotiation, but as comfort. And you realize feather cloaks weren't only about power or history, they were also about dreams. Here's the broad truth. Cloaks often carried personal meaning. They were worn not only in ceremonies and battles, but in intimate moments, births, farewells, even sleep. Some families wrapped their loved ones in cloaks at night, believing the feathers carried both warmth and ancestral protection. Imagine lying down with the hush of feathers around you, like being tucked in by generations. And here's the curious part. Some oral traditions speak of cloaks being used in dreams themselves. People said a cloak could carry your spirit safely through the night, like a canoe crossing dark waters. In that sense, cloaks weren't just garments, they were lullabies you could wear. You smile at the thought of a cloak acting like the world's first weighted blanket, except instead of polyester beads, it's filled with history. Historians, of course, puzzle over this too. Were cloaks really part of everyday rest, or are these memories symbolic, exaggerated in later retellings? Some argue only chiefs had the privilege of sleeping under cloaks. Others insist it was a common practice within families. The truth may be both, sometimes sacred, sometimes ordinary, sometimes shifting with the needs of the moment. As you listen, the cloak around the sleeper rustles faintly in the breeze. The feathers catch starlight, and for a moment you could swear they look like constellations stitched into fabric. It's as if the night sky itself has bent down, offering its quiet companionship. Here's a quirky detail. Some cloaks were said to sing when the wind moved through them, the feathers creating faint rustling sounds. For children drifting off, that sound was comforting. Cloak whispering lullabies only it knew. You imagine trying to explain to someone that your blanket sings to you, they'd laugh. But here, it makes perfect sense. The fire has long gone out, but the warmth lingers. The cloak doesn't just cover the body, it anchors the soul, watching the sleeper. You realize you're not just witnessing tradition, you're witnessing tenderness, the simplest, quietest form of love woven into feathers. And maybe that's the real legacy, not just power, wealth, or status, but the soft assurance that you're never alone, not even in dreams. And now, the feathers settle, the cloaks we've followed through firelight and council halls, through trade routes and museums. I quietly in memory, you feel them draped around your shoulders, so light, warm, whispering softly. Every rustle is an ancestor saying goodnight. The stories blur, like colors bleeding together in twilight. Chiefs, weavers, children, even gods will fade into a calm hum. You're not asked to remember every detail, only to let the comfort of the journey linger, like feathers brushing against skin. So breathe slowly, let the weight of history feel like a blanket. Let the night sky above you become a cloak of its own, stitched with stars, stitched with silence. You've walked far enough for tonight. Close your eyes, the cloaks will keep you safe, and somewhere between one breath and the next, you'll already be dreaming.